I can say from personal experience, as someone who's in recovery, who's made a laundry list of bad decisions, I've been very open and honest and transparent with my children about the laundry list of bad decisions that I've made so that they know, one, that people aren't bad, that people are sick and can make bad decisions as a result of their illness.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Partnership Perspectives, a child welfare training and education podcast for those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare. My name is Stan Brazier. I'm the project director for the learning partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost, to hardworking professionals and others. Before we begin, please note a disclaimer that the views expressed by the host and guests of this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the college, DCYF, or any organization our guests may represent. Today we have a returning guest as well as a new guest joining to talk about trends in substance use, busting myths related to substance use disorder, and how we can take this latest information and apply it to working with individuals and families. Overdose deaths are declining in Rhode Island. In 2024, 57% of overdose deaths involved illicit fentanyl compared to 2014 when that rate was 35%. And while there has been a decrease in fatal overdoses caused by illicit drugs like heroin, there has been an increase in overdoses involving prescription drugs, which rose from 11% in 2023 to 16% in 2024. Additionally, recent data shows that according to the Rhode Island Department of Health in 2022, Rhode Island tied for having the highest percentage of any state of alcohol-impaired traffic fatalities in the country of 43% compared to the national average of 32%. Law enforcement has expressed concern about increased cannabis-impaired driving as well, especially since legalization, but quantitative data is sparse. That is our backdrop. Our guests today are Chris Dorval and Jennifer O'Neill. Chris is the executive director at Ocean State Recovery Center. He is a nationally recognized speaker, trainer, and clinical consultant in the areas of addiction, trauma, and men's health, as well as having worked as a clinician and clinical supervisor in various levels of care in the addiction treatment continuum. Our other guest is Jen O'Neill, who's a dedicated advocate with over 15 years of experience advancing the mission of Mothers Against Drug Driving, or MADD. Her deep-rooted passion for the cause began in college as a court monitor intern and has since grown through a variety of impactful roles, including youth prevention specialist, victim services specialist, and now program manager for MADD Rhode Island. Throughout her tenure, Jen has led statewide efforts to prevent impaired driving, support victims and survivors, and engage youth and communities in meaningful prevention work. Chris and Jen, thank you both for being here and taking the time out of your busy schedules. Welcome to the show here.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for welcoming me back. A lot of times I go somewhere and that's usually the last time I'm not welcome back.
Friend of the pod status. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. And welcome, Jennifer, as well.
Yes, thanks so much for having us here.
Of course. So I guess for both of you, really, what have you seen like in your own work, and how might the picture of substance use disorder change in, say, the last 10 years? And maybe is there any impact that COVID has had? Is there any impact on, I mentioned the legalization of cannabis? What's kind of the changing picture of substance use, particularly in Rhode Island?
Sure. So I'll start off, and from my perspective, working on the front lines in treatment, one of the things we're seeing, and this is definitely a post-COVID trend, is an increase in alcohol use disorder as a primary diagnosis. I think prior to COVID, the majority of people we saw entering into treatment, particularly, at a structured treatment level, whether it was intensive outpatient, partial hospitalization, or residential, it was opioid use disorder. And, since COVID and around COVID and moving forward, I think we saw a drastic increase in alcohol to the point where, looking at our census data in 2024, we had 71% of our admissions were primary diagnosis of alcohol use disorder compared to number 2, which is opioids, which is 12%. So, almost more than 2/3 of our population, our treatment population in our facility right now is alcohol use disorder. And I think that's one based on accessibility and availability. During COVID, there was definitely, alcohol, liquor stores and bars were kept open. You know what I mean? Gyms were closed, fitness centers, things like that. But like, we got to make sure people have alcohol. And, there's an increase in anxiety, increase in isolation, increase in loneliness, increase in all of these things. And alcohol just shot through the roof. And I think we saw a lot of people who were what we call, what they would call casual or recreational drinkers quickly turn into problem drinkers, or the common term of alcoholic, because of the accessibility. If they weren't home, they were working, they were stressed, they were anxious, they were now working from home. 5 o'clock came a lot earlier. And so, 2 o'clock, I can have a glass of wine as opposed to waiting till the end of the day. And, from 2 to 5, those 3 hours afforded for a couple more drinks than normal. And then the tolerance built up, and then here we go. All right, back to work, and people are struggling. So that is one of the main things we've seen. I think that's increased alcohol. Another thing that we've seen is just the abundance and prevalence of a tainted drug supply on the opioid side. As somebody who's in recovery myself, when I was actively using, fentanyl was something that we knew of, but we didn't see very often. And when we saw it, we knew we were getting it. Like, you were purchasing fentanyl with the intent to purchase fentanyl. And that was, back in 2006, 2007, 2008. Around 2010, 2012, it started becoming, you thought you were purchasing heroin, and now you were purchasing fentanyl. Right. And the overdose, that's when we started to see overdose deaths spike. 2020, 2021, we started to see the addition of xylazine as a cutting agent, and we started to see that. And so I think education has been really good in terms of making people aware of a tainted drug supply. But again, and I think we talked about this in the last time I was here, I think that has definitely helped to decrease overdose deaths. There's been a lot of policies that have helped, whether it's harm reduction policies, making Narcan more available, fentanyl test strips, and things like that I think have helped. But what it hasn't done is addressed the underlying disease, right? And so instead of seeing people get help, it's just pushed people, all right, well, opiates are going to kill me, I'll just drink, right? Or opiates are going to kill me, I'll use meth, right? And the logic, it doesn't sound logical, but I think that's the direction people have gone. Well, that'll kill you, let's try something else. Right. And now, with the way that the drug supply is so tainted, even those other drugs that weren't opioid based are now finding it, whether it's, they're finding it in THC, they're finding it in amphetamines, they're finding it in, counterfeit benzodiazepines that people are buying. And so, unless you're buying prescription pills over the counter from a pharmacist, you don't know what you're getting if you're buying drugs on the street anymore. And you can assume, based on the data, that looking at Rhode Island data, 67% in 2023, 2024, 67% of drug samples that were collected contain fentanyl. And of those 57% of those also contain xylazine. Right. And so, that has definitely been a major factor. Mm-hmm. And then finally, the third big factor is the legalization of cannabis. Mm-hmm. Legalization is just that. It is legal, right? Alcohol is legal. Technically OxyContin is legal. If we're going to look at things from a legal perspective, legalization does not equal safety. Sure. However, when people hear legal, they hear safe, right? And so if it's legal, it can't be bad for me, right? And I don't know how many people I've heard, well, I buy my cannabis at a dispensary, it's organic. It's not organic, and it's not Whole Foods. It's like, it's not organic. It's a genetically modified organism, organic, if you will. THC or cannabis that you would find growing wild, in nature, contains about 6 to 10% THC content. The stuff that you're buying, the stuff that you can buy at dispensaries is around 60 to 70% THC content. And some of the concentrations like oils and dabs and hash and stuff like that is in the 90s. So those are not organic strains of cannabis. Those are legalized, genetically modified organisms with the intention of developing a dependence and addiction. Right. So, I think that has, the belief that safety is tied to legalization has definitely driven up the rates of cannabis use disorder.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of information you just gave us there, and there's a lot to unpack there. So let's quickly maybe say, can you tell us what exactly is fentanyl? What exactly is xylazine? Because it seems like the prevalence has really skyrocketed over the last few years. What exactly are these two substances?
So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It's synthetic in that it doesn't exist in nature. Most opioids that we typically hear them referred to as opiates, opiate. Those are derived from the poppy plant, right? So morphine, heroin, oxycodone, hydromorphone, those are all derived from opium poppy, and they're drugs that we've used in various stages for pain killing, with the exception of heroin, for pain killing and analgesic effect at some point in there. They've been FDA approved for uses in certain procedures and pain relief. Opioids are anything that is synthetic, anything that is not real, that's created in a laboratory. So it's not derived from an opioid. It's not derived from the poppy plant. Fentanyl itself is probably the most, if not the most powerful opioid. And it's been around for years. It exists in every operating room and hospital. It's been used for breakthrough pain for folks with cancer and in really acute chronic pain. It's been used in surgical and anesthesia settings for years, and it's very effective at what it does. However, the concentration of it and the effectiveness has made it a very marketable drug for the illicit drug trade. Because if you're looking at a kilogram of heroin, right, and we've all seen them on television or movies or something like that, you're looking at something about the size of a banana bread, and that is 1,000 grams, and that 1,000 grams of heroin can be broken down into smaller parts and sold off to a point where a bag, the size of a salt packet that you'd get at a restaurant, in those little paper packets, would be enough to, cause a euphoric effect in somebody. With fentanyl, you're talking about 3 of those grains of salt would cause the same euphoric effect that the entire salt packet. So if you look at it condensed-wise, rather than trying to ship something the size of a banana bread, I can now ship something the size of, say, half a lime in a much smaller area, a much more concentrated area, and then redistribute it, right? So if I'm if I'm used to packaging, 2,000 kilograms in a warehouse or in a storage container, I could now stick them in a purse, and the same amount of effectiveness, or euphoric effect, can be produced from the amount that can be carried in a purse versus the amount that can be carried in a storage container. And so that has made it a really marketable drug for people in the illicit drug trade. And so the challenge with that is when you start mixing it in, right? Our street drug dealers, for all of their abilities, are not chemists, and I'm sure they're not working, to ensure purity and dilution across all of their bags, right? Each bag so you don't know if the bag that you have contains the 3 salt grains that you need to produce an euphoric effect, or maybe 16 salt grains, and the naked eye can't tell the difference, especially when it's mixed in with other things. And so, one bag might be good, the next bag might be fatal, and there's no way of knowing. And, we have seen with fentanyl test kits the ability to test it, but even still, in the mind of a person in active addiction, even if it says this is fentanyl and this is a high purity of fentanyl, that doesn't mean, the average person who's buying drugs and use it with the intention of using them is not going to throw it away. They're not going to say, "Oh, this is a bad one. Let me throw it away. Let me see if I can go get my money back." Right? Like, can I find the receipt? Like, the return policy on illicit drugs is not very good. And so, what will often happen is like, well, let me try and use a little bit.
Yeah.
And a little bit, again, we're playing with fire. How much is a little bit? Like, all right, I'll just push half of it in and see if it happens. And again, opioid overdoses don't happen like we see in the movies. They don't typically happen like I push the plunger in, or I inhale, and 2 seconds later I fall on the ground and I pass out. It's usually I push the plunger in and I inhale. I feel that euphoric rush. I feel that feeling. And then maybe a couple hours later, or a half hour later, or 40 minutes later, I slip into respiratory depression, and and it looks like I'm falling asleep, when really I'm, my heart's slowing down. I'm hypotensive. My respiratory rate drops, and I die. So fentanyl is a very, very dangerous, powerful, really easy to move and really accessible drug, and really effective drug. Add in xylazine, which is now a drug that's been used in veterinary medicine for years. And again, it's a derivative of clonidine. And clonidine is a blood pressure drug. And so it's not an opioid. It does have some effects on the kappa opioid receptors, but it is not an opioid itself. And as such, Narcan, naloxone, the antidote that we use to reverse overdoses doesn't work on it because it's not working on the same receptor sites. But it has a similar effects, physiological effects that an opioid would have in terms of the symptoms with respiratory depression, decreasing hypotension, so drop in blood pressure, and a specific spike in rebound hypertension once the drug wears off. So if you have this drug that's suppressing your blood pressure for so long, and then when it wears off, what we'll see, especially with people with histories of cardiac problems, is now because the body is trying to overcompensate for the drop in blood pressure, your body's natural chemicals, if you will, are trying to, raise that blood pressure back off. So now when the substance wears off, you have this huge spike, which can almost result in like a heart attack because it's trying to overcompensate for the fact that it's been depressed for so long. And so, but xylazine has been around for years and used in veterinary medicine, primarily as an anesthetic for its muscle relaxing and its sedating properties, also used as an anemic, right, to help, specifically with cats, but in other animals as well, to help animals throw up, right? Which, again, mimics some of the side effects of a very euphoric high that you would get from opioids, right? I remember very well in my active addiction, if I used something and it immediately made me throw up, I thought, oh, this is good, right? And so again, it's throwing off green flags for people who are using opiates that this is something that's good, when really it's something that's different, that's looking like it's good, that's probably going to kill you.
And more, less, or about the same as difficult to identify as fentanyl in the supply?
I think less because it's not easy to detect in terms of both point of care testing. So like the rapid testing.
There's no test kit for it.
There are test kits, but they're not as readily available as fentanyl because this is something that came along kind of afterwards. And so we've been rushing to get you. It's not, they're not as accessible. I think they are accessible. And I think that, there are programs out there in the harm reduction world that are working to make them more accessible, but they're not as effective. It's not as accessible as fentanyl test kits. And with both fentanyl and xylazine, if you change a particular structure within the molecular structure, now it's no longer detectable, right? And so if I have, and I'm just making things up as I go along here, but if I have 14 carbon atoms in this one xylazine structure, and then I add 15 to the next one, molecularly, it may still have the same side effects or similar side effects to what I have, but it's no longer detectable on the previous test that was designed to detect it. Right. And so all I have to do is alter the chemical structure. We've seen that a lot, particularly with fentanyl. Just to rewind for a second, like pharmaceutical grade fentanyl that you would get in an emergency room if you went in for acute, following a car accident, has a very short half-life. How long it lasts, I think the half-life of it is 30 to 60 minutes or something like that. So let's say, and again, I'm ballparking here, but I think it's about 60 minutes. So after about 60 minutes of the effects of fentanyl, then it wears off, right? Okay. Half of it is gone. With the molecular changes that we've seen in these, black market laboratories that are producing it in both Mexico, China, or wherever else, now the half-life in some of these fentanyl analogs is 7 to 10 days. So that's a significant adjustment in terms of the molecular structure and the chemical structure. We've seen people test positive for fentanyl, on a single use, sometimes 2 weeks later, where realistically it shouldn't be detectable within 24 hours. And 2 weeks later in a controlled environment where there is no, the opportunity for them to have used, they're still testing positive for it. And that's just a result of the changes in molecular structure. The other thing that's really marketable about xylazine is anyone can buy it. And so, like I mentioned, it's been used in veterinary medicine, but you can buy it on the internet right now, and it's legally without a VMV. You don't have to have a license. Right, you can find someplace.
I didn't know that.
And its cost is somewhere between $6 and $20 a kilogram. So you can buy 1,000 grams for $10. And so as a cutting agent,
business model.
It really is, unfortunately, and so it's cheap, it's easily accessible. We don't have to smuggle it. You can buy it, right? It's here. It's already here. Nothing's better for a smuggler than something that you can get in the country you're trying to smuggle it into. So it's not like we have to push this over the border. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're probably going to see is, as effective as blocking drugs outside of our borders we haven't shut down the need.
The supply.
Yeah,
that's
yeah, the
already
demand.
there. Yeah,
The demand is still
that's
there.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe we ruin the supply chain,
Yeah.
but the demand is still there. And when the demand is still there, and you have a substance that's easily supplied within the demand zone, that is what you're going to see increasing.
And it sounds like the demand can shift from substance to substance too,
yes.
because there will be an appetite regardless of what the substance is. The appetite will shift because the substance use disorder is still there. The underlying problems are still there, right? So, and I want to come back to kind of like the overdoses, but you started to, when you were talking about the increase in alcohol use disorder. So maybe Jen, you can kind of help tie this in to some of the work that MAD does and like what you're seeing and some of the work that you do to try to prevent driving while impaired. And are you seeing some of the same things with, I know that I mentioned in the intro was back from 2022. Are we still seeing high rates of driving under the influence of alcohol? What's the sort of status situation with driving under the influence of cannabis? And we know this is like a lot harder to detect, but can you kind of fill us in on that and help to kind of tie those two things together?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I will say across the country, when we're looking at data, just impaired driving in general, specifically alcohol impaired driving, because that's the data that we're able to collect currently, it has significantly increased since 2019. You mentioned that, available data, unfortunately, so much of what we analyze is still being determined, right? When we look at data from the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, for instance, they don't finalize their full crash data, usually for 2 or 3 years because of toxicology reports.
Okay, makes sense.
Because there will be, DUIs that are serious bodily injury that end up being death resulting. And so those numbers will change and they shift. So there's a lot of different factors. And we also wait to see if cases are adjudicated, depending on how we're reporting those numbers. But I can say, like, when we're looking at the preliminary data in Rhode Island, we're still much higher than across the country. Rhode Island, typically, when you look at our fatal crash numbers, just about half of them are impaired driving specific. And unfortunately, like you mentioned before, the data is so sparse for cannabis impaired driving in general right now, because so often we're seeing this trend of polysubstance use where someone is under the influence of both alcohol and cannabis. So they're pulled over and, we have their BAC level, and a DUI is a DUI regardless of the substance.
Right.
So given that we have that science for blood alcohol concentration, they're going to charge it specific to alcohol, and the data might only include alcohol when that driver was likely also under the influence of cannabis. And it's interesting to see just that trend in the culture surrounding cannabis legalization, like was mentioned with just legal doesn't necessarily mean safe. And the concept where, we'll have candid conversations with adults where they're like, well, I get behind the wheel, but I only had one beer. Well, if you had one beer and you also took an edible and you also vaped,
Right.
those two substances together and their synergetic effects and how impaired you actually are and feeling differently, is going to make you drive differently. So we're seeing those trends, but it's difficult for us from the data standpoint to not have the real true numbers yet for cannabis. And even when we look at legalization that happened and all numbers and things like that in Colorado and other states that, went legal before we did, their numbers still just aren't quite there yet because we don't have that exact science yet that we're using. We need DREs, drug recognition experts, to be able to determine if someone is under the influence of an illicit substance or a legal substance like cannabis. So that's still evolving, but it's definitely changing just the culture in general about substance use and driving.
So the actual data is lagging behind a little bit, but maybe anecdotally, what are some things that you've heard, and maybe kind of question for the both of you, like what's going on in that individual's mind? They're getting behind the wheel and their BAC is, what's the legal, 0.08 is the legal limit, right? So, and they're getting behind the wheel and it's 0.2 or something, right? Like what's going on neurologically? What's going on inside this person's head where they're saying, yeah, I'm okay. I'm fine to drive. Or is that what do you think? And maybe putting research aside, maybe just anecdotally or some things that you've heard, or you think what might be sort of your suspicion about what some of the reasons for why these driving while impaired rates are so high here in Rhode Island.
Well, I think with your commentary regarding like the amount of BAC, I think one thing that I notice anecdotally a lot in having conversations and doing presentations is a lot of individuals in general don't actually know how many drinks it takes them to get to that 0.08 BAC.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
for myself, for instance, like I could get to a 0.08 BAC having 2 drinks. So if I were to be, going out after work or something like that, like being able to recognize that, I think is a very important piece. And then when we think of like science and what impairment looks like, we're seeing data and evidence that shows that someone that is at a 0.05 is already starting to have impairment behind the wheel. Like their reaction time is starting to slow at that point. Their ability to analyze like the roadway if something's coming out in front of them, their likeliness of speeding is a lot different. So just in looking at their ability to drive, it's already starting to decrease even at that 0.02. But when we're thinking about do they know they're at 0.08 and where that stands, I think that's a big piece of it is people just understanding that level of impairment if they're only under the influence of alcohol, but then understanding the combination of the polysubstance use and how that impacts their ability to drive.
It makes me think of the buzz driving is impaired driving slogan, right? And I think that a lot of people will kind of push that to the side, right? They say that I'm buzzed, I'm not really drunk yet. I'm not really, I'm just a little buzzed, but you're already actually impaired.
I'm on
right?
the low end.
I'm on the low end, so I'm okay.
Spectrum.
Yeah,
Yes.
right,
Yes.
exactly, right. But that's, I think people kind of push that sort of slogan to the side and they say, I'm just, 1 or 2 drinks or whatever. Right? So.
And then I'll say too, candidly, so often one of those myths that we try to dispel in our conversations at MAD, I hear so often people say, well, I drive better when I'm high. And there's this concept of driving under the influence of cannabis is much safer than driving under the influence of alcohol. And so having those conversations and trying to change those perspectives is something that we're actively doing because you hear it so often.
Some truth to that statement. And it's one of those myths that is also somewhat factual. And I'll tell you why. So THC, the main psychoactive compound in cannabis mimics a brain chemical or a neurotransmitter called anandamide, right? And so anandamide is a substance in your brain that helps you get rid of information that one of its functions is helping you get rid of information that you don't need, right? And so like Jen and I both walked in here today from the parking lot stand, you did as well. Do you know how many steps you took? Do you know how many books you walked by on the way into this room? You know what I mean? And probably not, right? But you saw it and it happened and it went to your brain and your brain said, well, this is not important. Let me get rid of this information. Mm-hmm. So anandamide is a substance that comes in and helps you organize information. So anandamide has a half-life in terms of effectiveness in your brain of seconds, right? THC mimics anandamide, but it has a half-life of between 7 and 15 days. And so it is doing the same thing that of helping you get rid of information that's not important. And so you'll see people say, I play the guitar better, or I play music better when I'm impaired, when I'm stoned, or I drive better, or I sing better, or I can focus more on my exams, or whatever the case may be. And that's true. They can focus really good on what's in front of them, right? I could stay between the 2 yellow lines. But what I can't do is recognize something coming out of my peripheral vision and see a child that's running across the street, or recognize that there's a car coming this way and I need to slow down or yield, or they don't see those other things because THC is acting to get rid of that information that it deems as not important because it's acting like anandamide. Now, again, I said anandamide lasts for seconds. Mm-hmm. THC lasts for 7 to 15 days, depending upon, and there's a bunch of factors, but depth of inhalation, potency of THC. Now, the challenge here is that even if a person is not acutely intoxicated from THC, meaning they didn't just use it, 7 to 15 days later, it's still affecting those systems that impact spatial awareness, time reaction, sensory information, all of these other things. And so I don't care if you haven't used today, you're still impaired by the THC you used 2 weeks ago. And I have a friend and a colleague named Ben Court who's out in Colorado who speaks a lot about cannabis use and his, and it's all factual, but he's gotten to the point where he's gotten death threats about his facts that he's shared about THC and cannabis use. Like legitimate, like people have come to his house and said, I'm going to kill you, and put it in his mailbox. And it's like gotten to the point where it's scary for him. And he's been a huge advocate of, smarter legalization. And one of the things that he's pointed out is that these things happen, and that, when people are impaired, it's going to last 2 weeks later. And so it's not that we want to stop people from using and driving, when they've used. It's that maybe we have to look at, if you have a cannabis card or like a legal, or now that it's legal, you don't even need a card, that you shouldn't drive at all. Right? Or there should be some way to prove that you're no longer impaired. And the FAA, interestingly enough, did one of the earliest, and in my opinion, one of the most effective studies on cannabis use. So right around the time that medicalization was coming out with cannabis, the FAA started looking at it, because you want to know what pilots can and can't use, right? They're flying planes that we get in, and the crash rate, I mean, we don't want those planes crashing. Right. And so what they did is they took pilots and they put them up in flight simulators, not real planes, right? Good controlled study here, but flight simulators, and they had a handful of pilots. I don't know what the end was, but they had them fly and perform certain maneuvers, and certain things would happen, and they said, all right, all these pilots can do what they're supposed to do. 100% of them did what they were supposed to do. And then they had that handful, that sample size of pilots go out and get high. Here's an edible, go smoke some weed, come back. And a few hours later, they put these pilots in the same flight simulators, and like 97% of them were able to do what they needed to do, which is pretty impressive, right? Considering muscle memory. That means 3% of planes crash. Mm-hmm. You getting in the plane? You getting in the plane if 3% of them are not going to go well? No. You know what I mean? Like, nope, we can't have them use and fly a plane. Got it. Nailed down. They took the same pilots and they brought them back a week later, and it was like 99. Mm-hmm. Now, still 1% were not able to do what they were able to do a week prior, right? Which again, they said, if you are a pilot and you have a medical card for cannabis and you intend to use it, you're no longer a pilot, or at least you're not a pilot that can fly. And so why the Department of Transportation hasn't looked at that and said, you know what, maybe we should do the same thing for people operating there are way more people operating motor vehicles than operating planes. Sure. And there are way more car accidents every year than there are plane accidents. And yes, people can survive a car accident a little bit better than a plane accident. However, the frequency would kind of push you towards like maybe that, and that's fine. I'm totally like, I'm not one of these people that believes that people shouldn't use drugs, right? Mm-hmm. Do what you want to do. But there are certain rights or certain privileges, I guess, mm-hmm. that you should give up if you're going to choose to do these certain things.
So as you're talking, and I'm thinking, where this is a child welfare podcast, right? So what about your ability to parent? You become laser focused on
vacuuming,
else,
but you don't realize your 2-year-old is right near a staircase that's going down. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you become, okay, well, I only smoke when my kids go to bed at night. Mm-hmm. I don't know anybody who has kids that sleep all the way through the night until they're like teenagers, and even then you're even more, you need to have your head on a swivel.
They're not going to bed till 2 a.m.
Yeah, that's exactly. Like, true story. I saw my 12-year-old this morning. What time did you go to bed last night? Like 2:30. I'm like, what were you doing for those 5 hours between when I left you and what I have no idea. So
Fortnite or something.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Just your ability to parent is definitely impaired. And again, there's no such thing as the perfect parent. Right? Anyone that has children or can get truly honest will admit that. However, you can't be the perfect parent that you could be if you're using substances.
And it goes back to, I think, the safety aspect of it. Well, it's legal, so it's safe. And so I'm gonna, I'm gonna have some drinks. I'm gonna, take an edible or something like that, and it's fine because it's legal. It must be safer. It's fine, So,
well, and some of the data that came out of Colorado right after the legalization stuff was very interesting when they looked at the incidence of infant asthma rates skyrocketed like 90%. Acute admissions for psychosis skyrocketed. Cannabis-induced hyperemesis, just nonstop vomiting as a result of cannabis use, was something that we never really saw before, and now we're seeing it more frequently. There's a lot of data that pushes like, yes, safe, like, and here's my opinion. Legalization actually tends to make things less safe, right? The 2 number 1 killers in the United States are heart disease and lung disease, McDonald's is legal, right? Like fast food is legal, trans fats are legal, right? The cigarettes are legal, right? And those two highest causing deaths can be directly or at least correlationally related to legal things, right?
Yeah.
And so legality actually increases fatality, in my opinion, or at least what the science pushes towards in correlation. So making something legal is not going to make it safe. As a matter of fact, it's probably going to make it less safe.
Right. I want to keep doing some myth busting. So, myth or fact, people feel safer to use because Narcan is more readily available.
I'd say that's a fact. I think people feel like, okay, if I have this, or at least this is around or more available, so using is safer. At the same time, as we've talked about, as education, becomes more prevalent about xylazine and fentanyl and the effectiveness of Narcan on fentanyl, which is so much more powerful than most opioids. And sometimes it takes 3, 4, 5 doses of Narcan to reverse an overdose. And it's zero or very little effectiveness on xylazine, that people are saying like, it's safer, but it's still not safe. And so I'd say people may feel safer, but I think the reality is that people still don't feel safe, even with the prevalence of Narcan. And I think that's a good thing. I think that you shouldn't feel safe. I mean, it's nice to have, it's like wearing a seatbelt when you're in a car.
Right.
You don't say like, let me go crash it because I've got this seatbelt on.
Exactly.
You think like, hopefully this will save my life in the event that something bad happens. But I don't think people are out there just driving their cars into walls just to test the effectiveness of their seatbelt.
Sure.
I just feel like that's a great segue for me with the seatbelt element of just impaired driving,
Absolutely.
right? No, because that is one of those things that we talk about all the time. Like that's your last chance, protection against an impaired driver, because we're sharing the roads with impaired drivers every day, no matter what time of day it is. And when we're looking at that data, like I said, about the Department of Transportation, we look at our fatality data. Well, more than half of our fatal crashes, the individuals who died were not wearing their seatbelt. So when we look at that, it's like, okay, how many of those lives could have been saved if they did have that last chance protection? And how important just even those little elements are, again, for harm reduction, but it is something that needs to be said more often, right?
It's interesting to think about the similarities there, right? That people feeling safe or not safe and feeling like, oh, I don't need a seatbelt because of whatever,
Well, in both substances, cannabis or any substance really, but cannabis and alcohol in particular are disinhibiting substances, right? And so what sounds like a really good idea or a really bad idea when you haven't had anything to drink or smoke or use doesn't sound like a terrible idea after 2 drinks. After 10 drinks, you're like, seatbelt, schmeatbelt. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not putting that on. And so there's a reason. There are a lot of times when we see people, you'd asked earlier about, what goes through the mind of a person who's hopping behind the wheel while they're intoxicated. I don't think many people, or any people for that matter, get behind the wheel and say, I'm going to see if I can make it home and not die, right? Like, I think everybody thinks I'll be fine, right? And every person I've ever talked to who's had a DUI or drove an impaired gave me a very, to them, justifiable reason of why they had to get in their car and drive home, right? Like, I needed my car for work tomorrow. I didn't mean to get this drunk. And so, it's unfortunate that I did, but I still have to get home, or this isn't my car. This is my sister's car and she needs it for work tomorrow, or I can't leave my car here because it'll get towed, or whatever the case may be. The reason is very justifiable to them at the time when they're justifying the reason. But to anybody that's ever been on the other side of being involved in a drunk driving accident, whether you've been a victim or lost a loved one as a result of it, there is no justification for what you've done. And I think that the mind of a person getting behind the wheel can justify, once they're impaired, can justify anything. Right. But there is no justification.
It's amazing to see celebrities too that, end up with a DUI, and it's like it's so easily and with the obviously increased crazy availability of Uber and Lyft and everything like out there, you have to wonder. But like you said, if you can justify anything, you can convince yourself that it's safe, right? So
and I'll note too, when you're looking at that and thinking about that, the decisions and logic of someone who's actively impaired are going to be much different than someone who is not, right? And so just thinking of that and those points of choice, when we're talking about these crashes, and you'll notice I say crash and not that A word, right? It's not in my vocabulary when I'm talking about impaired driving, because regardless of whether or not they planned, to go and injure someone or kill someone,
Right.
you've still made that active decision to get behind the wheel impaired, and therefore it wasn't accidental, right? There was that conscious, you have that moment and that choice of decision to get behind that wheel, right? So it's making those
It's like accidentally
plans
shooting
ahead of
someone.
time.
Did you pull the trigger? That
Exactly.
wasn't an accident.
Right. No, it's still a murder.
You might not have
It's
meant to
still
hit
whatever
that
it may be.
person, but
Right.
you
Yeah,
definitely
so
meant to shoot.
So you'll hear me use that language and like always, when we're interacting with victims and survivors, like having them and just that power, because words matter, obviously, but having that power of facilitating that kind of conversation and referring to impaired driving specifically as being crashes, and because there's that decision point, right? There's so many options. Celebrities
Ownership,
have options because they have the
responsibility.
finances, but
Yeah.
every person has an option, right? Everyone has that ability to find a
Accountability
different ride.
that should be
Yes.
taken. Yeah. All right. Myth or fact? Harm reduction saves lives.
I think it's a fact. It absolutely, saves lives, and there's a need for it. There's definitely data, indisputable data that it saves lives and it prevents worse things from happening. I will add to it that it can't be the end all of the policy. Right. So it's saving lives, but what do we do with those lives that we've just saved, particularly those of the people those of the individuals who are the ones that are impaired, right? So not necessarily the victims, but the perpetrators. So yes, we've stopped them from, making a fatal decision or an irreversible decision, but what next? And a lot of times, when we look at our legal system, our criminal justice system, it's very punitive. Do this, and this, and once you've done that, we're done with you. Right? It shouldn't be that way. It should be long-term. It should require treatment because treatment works. Treatment absolutely works. Monitoring works. I reference the FAA again in terms of, if a pilot becomes impaired and enters into the FAA's monitoring program, it lasts for, I think, 5 to 10 years for a first offense. So one offense, and you're monitored with random screens at any time. You're required to do treatment. You're required to do pretty much whatever they say for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's fine if you don't want to. And again, fine if you don't want to do certain things, but you just can't fly anymore, right? And so that's fine if you don't want to get treatment and you don't want to have to submit to random toxicology screens for 5 years after your first offense DUI. That's fine. You just can't ever drive again. And, Jen and I were talking about this before we started here. It started here today, but driving is a privilege, right? It is not a right.
Yeah.
It is not, you don't have a right to drive. You have the opportunity to drive. And there are certain times that things that we do, certain behaviors, can be taken away from us as a result of giving up those privileges, right? And it's not, like we talk about rights and, well, this is a constitutional right, and it's not a constitutional right. And as a matter of fact, we have precedent, with removal of firearm privileges from people, which is a constitutional right. To own and possess a firearm is a constitutional right, but we've taken it away from people who've committed felonies or committed even misdemeanor domestic violence offenses. We say, you can't have this constitutional right, you forfeited it. And I think those rights or privileges, even something that is less than a right, can be taken away and forfeited by people who've committed certain offenses that that are very likely to reoffend.
Quickly on harm reduction, I know this is a controversial topic. I'm not even really sure where Rhode Island is on this, but safe injection sites, does it fall under the umbrella of harm reduction?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Is it research-based? I know just for the novice, where does the controversy come in, I guess?
Well, the controversy comes in a few different areas with safe injection sites. Yes, the data has shown them to be effective, particularly in Europe and some of the Scandinavian countries where, opioid use has been very prevalent. And what they've seen is a decrease in overdose-related deaths. They've seen a decrease in disease transmission as a result of, particularly with IV use, because they're using clean needles, they're using clean cookers, they're using clean, instruments. Where the controversy comes in, for one, is where are you putting them? Because you're definitely not putting one in East Greenwich, right? You're definitely not putting one in, not to, to poke fun at anybody's neighborhood, but you're putting them in the worst possible neighborhood. So you're taking a neighborhood that's already oppressed and you're saying, like, we're going to put these safe injection sites in your neighborhood.
Is there a strong enough link to getting people into recovery?
From what I've seen, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. That should be the push in there, is that,
Right.
you know, and that has been one of the rallying cries behind people with safe injection sites, is we're working really hard to push people to get connected with services and get recovery and get into treatment. But I don't know how effective it is. I mean, I know that there is a safe injection site here in Rhode Island that is operating. I don't know at what capacity it's operating. I don't know how many people are walking through the door every day. I can tell you that in its time of operation, I have not got contacted one time for a referral from somebody from that safe injection site. It's so, maybe that's on me for not marketing myself better and standing down there with pamphlets or dropping cards off. But I just don't know if that's where you go if you're looking for help. I don't think, I mean, I know we did something a few years ago, which sounded good on paper, right? You can go to the fire department and ask for help. And, it sounds good, right? Like, go to any fire station and tell them I need help. I talked to a number of firefighters, like, no one comes in here and asks for help. Except for the people that need a place to sleep, or they want a sandwich. They're not, not many people are walking in there looking, with their insurance card, where can I get help? And it's just because I don't know if the culture of that, the fire department is where you would think to go for help or treatment with substance use. Right. And I think probably the same thing in a safe injection site. Like, I'm going here to get high. I'm not going here to get help. I mean, it seems kind of controversial to look for help at a place that you're not going to get help.
But it seems like it's only solving half the problem.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
It's helping reduce overdoses and overdose deaths, but it's not really getting people to recovery.
Similar to what we talked about. Similar to what we talked about with the, with the punitive laws around, drunk driving or, impaired driving, is that okay, we're stopping or we're slowing it down, but what are we doing with the people afterwards?
Exactly.
And that's the more important thing, because if we're not addressing what happens next, then we're really just putting a Band-Aid on a stab wound.
Right. All right. Myth or fact, medication-assisted treatment only makes someone dependent on a new substance and they're not really, quote unquote, in recovery.
I would say that's a myth. Yeah. Medication-assisted treatment works. I mean, there's data to support that it works. I've seen it work both firsthand and both on a personal and professional level. It definitely works. Now, I love that you said medication-assisted treatment and not MAT. And oftentimes we use the acronym MAT. And I think when we use the acronym, we lose the words, right? Because like you said, words matter. Medication-assisted treatment means the medication assists the treatment. Right. It is not the treatment. And so handing someone a pill or a film or an injectable or something like that is not the treatment. It's part of the treatment plan, but it is not the treatment. So, if I compare addiction to diabetes, which has similar relapse rates and remission, chronic disease, right? If I give someone insulin who's diabetic and say, here you go, just shoot some of this, or take this amount and this frequency and this dose, and don't change anything about what you're doing in your life, their diabetes is better, but it's not in remission, right? If they keep eating frosting for breakfast and having 12 sodas a day, their diabetes is not going to be controlled. And it's the same thing with a person with addiction. If I just hand them a bottle of pills and say, take these instead of the other ones you were taking, yes, they will probably do better, but they will not do their best. And so medication-assisted treatment does work to assist the treatment, but the treatment is more than just pharmacological. It has to be psychological, social, and spiritual as well.
Right. Gotta have all the aspects. Yep. Final Mythbuster. So we've talked a little bit about cannabis use and impaired driving, but maybe bust this one for us, myth or fact. So cannabis use doesn't impair driving the same way drinking might.
Well, so
complicated.
That is complicated. So it certainly does impair driving, right? But we even kind of discussed this before as well. We see different levels, different styles of impairment for someone who's impaired by alcohol versus by cannabis, right? Alcohol impaired drivers, you see a lot of speeding involved in those particular crashes. Whereas when we look at a cannabis impaired driver, it's like their depth perception and their ability to see things and react quickly if something comes comes out in front of the road. So certainly still the same danger involved in being impaired, but the type of impairment or the way that that driver is going to react behind the wheel might be a different between alcohol and cannabis, but equally dangerous to be behind the wheel under either substance. So.
Gotcha. Yeah.
It's a different type of danger, right? Like they're not swerving across the lines the way someone would do on alcohol, but they're directly between the lines at 18 miles an hour. Right?
In a 40?
Yes, exactly, on the highway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, all right. Sort of a final one for both of you. What are some of the demographic trends that you see? How might they be being addressed, especially if there's a lot of disparities racially, ethnically, in terms of like access to treatment or just a sort of disproportionality when it comes to individuals that are driving impaired or getting or not getting treatment? What are some of the trends that you see? Race, gender, ethnicity, culture, etc.
So I can say with factors specifically in Rhode Island, when we're analyzing the data of those who are causing our fatal crashes specifically, we find that it's usually men, specifically Caucasian men between the ages of 30 to 50 that are causing our fatal crashes. And many of them, unfortunately, also living with substance use disorder, which is why it's so important to be talking about recovery and how important that is and how addiction is a disease and people can recover. Because ultimately, we work and we constantly advocate to end impaired driving. Well, we're never going to truly end impaired driving if we don't control substance use disorder and find ways to help people actually find that route to recovery and cure the beginning problem there.
Right.
Yeah, and some of the demographic data that I had pulled from our agency, and this is looking back at our 2024 census. So the mean age of our sample, which was 384 patients, was 41 years old with a age range of 18 to 76. Now, I'll point out that we only treat adults. We're only licensed to treat adults, so we don't have any data on anyone under 18. With 26% of those, so 25% of that population being over the age of 50. When we look specifically related to substance or primary diagnosis, individuals with alcohol use disorder was 43% with an age range of 18 to 76. For opioids, was a much younger age median at 33, with the age range between 19 and 63. Cocaine was roughly 43 years old from mean with a range between 22 and 44 years. Amphetamines came in at an age range of 23 to 38 with a mean age of about 35 years old, 34.9, so we'll call that 35. And finally, cannabis. The age was the youngest at 31 years old, with the range between 22 and 52 years old. And then finally, sedatives, which would be your benzodiazepines. So the mean range there was 45 years old with an average age range between 23 and 64. And so what we're seeing is this midlife median, right, between 30 and 45, with opioids and cannabis being on the younger side, alcohol, cocaine, sedatives being, I guess, on the older side, which is weird saying the older side is 40 plus when you just turned 41 over the weekend. But I guess us old folks prefer those substances as opposed to the young kids that are doing the opiates and the and cannabis. So but there's a drastic range, right? There is it's basically between 18 to later adulthood, 60, 65, and so there's definitely an increase across the board of it seeming like it's more of an older adult thing, or at least an older adult thing getting help. Right. And that's important to note on this is, these are people that are seeking treatment, not necessarily those that are using. I think the prevalence of use is still very high among our younger populations, teenagers into early adulthood. But I don't think we see as many getting help for various reasons. Some of it's cultural, we're still young and it's a rite of passage. And then also, it hasn't gotten that bad yet, and I know, for myself, my own personal recovery, I was introduced to the idea of recovery when I was 16 years old. And I was like, well, it hasn't gotten that bad yet. I don't need for it to get that bad. And, at 24 years old, after having been incarcerated, experienced multiple overdoses, awaiting trial again, I remember going somewhere and being like, it can't get any worse. And, but still thinking, I haven't lost the job. I haven't lost the career. I haven't lost the house, the family, all these things that I hear people say that they've lost. And I was fortunate enough at 24 years old to have somebody whisper in my ear, that's because you're never going to have any of those things to lose, kid. And it was a harsh reality for me to realize that he was probably right. Like, I wasn't going to get to a point where I'd be able to lose the things that would be bad enough for me to stop.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, recovery can work at any age. We've had kids, we've had people come through our program at, 18, 19, 20 years old who are still, sober today, still in recovery today. And that's amazing, and to see someone get it at such a young age and see how much suffering they can avoid, and I've had people that have come in again, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, 70 years old. And, they hear these kids, again, kids that they call them, you're 19 years old. You don't even know you don't even know what loss looks like, but they hear them talk about, well, it hasn't gotten that bad. And the older generation of people in treatment are always saying, but you don't have to. It doesn't get easier. It does not get easier to get recovery when you've got a 30-year history of destroying things around you as opposed to a 3-year history, right? It doesn't get easier when you're in liver failure. It doesn't get easier when you've had multiple DUIs. It doesn't get easier when you've accidentally or done things, or when you've done things that have caused harm to other people. It does not get any easier. It doesn't get easier when you have AIDS to stop using, it doesn't get easier when you've lost your job, your insurance. It gets more difficult. And so if we can build the culture of awareness and knowledge around the fact that recovery is a heck of a lot easier when you're younger than it is when you've had years of destruction and abuse, then maybe we can start seeing those trends in terms of people, getting and staying in recovery at a younger age.
Yeah, it speaks to the whole justification, like your own personal story, and I'm sure a personal story of a lot of people, right, is that justification when they're younger, that it's not that bad, it's not really affecting me that much, I still have my job, I still have this, I still have that, I'm able to, you use the word functioning, fill in the blank, functioning alcoholic, functioning whatever, right? And that's just, I think, a misleading term of like, well, you still have the problem, right? You still have the issue. Just because you get up and go to work in the morning doesn't mean, sort of make it really that much better. Marginally maybe, right? But yeah, just any final thoughts to maybe raising awareness, like what can we, encourage social workers at DCYF, people that are working directly with kids and families to maybe talk to and start in conversations about raising awareness about how to prevent impaired driving, how to get access to recovery and treatment, that sort of thing. What are some things that we can kind of maybe just encourage people, social workers who are working with kids and families, to say to the people they're working with?
I think from the perspective of MAD, when we look at speaking to adults, we're usually having conversations with parents, right? Having conversations with them about how to talk to their youth about substance use, and that primary prevention element. And what we need to do more of is talk about that access for youth, right? Like with this legalization of cannabis and making sure that if adults are legally consuming cannabis, that that access is not provided to youth, right? They're locked away or they're secured in a certain capacity, right? And having those conversations as well with adults, again, harm reduction conversations with adults about their own use and understanding and recognizing, when they are impaired and when it is safe or not safe for them to get behind the wheel, and just amplifying that message. I mean, we talked about this, but didn't really fully bring up the fact that because of the way that Rhode Island's law is right this current moment, there's no level of cannabis that is deemed DUI. So any level of cannabis in the system can be a DUI. And so having those kind of conversations with adults, it's so important to understand, because like it was said, I mean, it can be weeks later, it still can be found in your system. So if someone's pulled over, for failure to maintain lane, and then there's a drug recognition expert that notices that they're failing their sobriety tests on the roadside there, it's
Right.
potentially going to be a DUI for them. So I think amplifying just those harm reduction messages, but especially with DCRF and with working with youth and adults, is like just having those general conversations about when it's safe to get in the car, like every child deserves a designated driver. driver.
Yeah.
And that means someone who's not, using substances
Sure.
in general. So,
Yeah.
as much as we
Yeah.
can have those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like people take driving for granted, right? Like Chris was saying, like they think it's just sort of their right, but it's really a privilege. It's like you get behind that wheel, you're driving a weapon, really. Like you're really taking your own life and everybody else's life into your hands when you get on the road. So, final thoughts?
Yeah, and to build off of what Jen said, I think those conversations that we have are that we have about recovery, about substance use, about the impact of impaired driving, about, are all contributing to kind of readjusting or readdressing the culture around substance use. I can say from personal experience, as someone who's in recovery, who's made a laundry list of bad decisions, I've been very open and honest and transparent with my children about the laundry list of bad decisions that I've made so that they know, one, that people aren't bad, that people are sick and can make bad decisions as a result of their illness, but that two, people can get better and they can stop making bad decisions. And three, that bad decisions are still bad, right? That drinking and getting behind the wheel of a car is a bad thing, right? Using drugs and putting other people's life at risk is a bad thing. And, it's funny because I was talking about this with my wife the other day. My kids are more anti-drug than I am, in a way. And I don't try to be anti-drug around them. I just tell them the truth about how drugs affected me, about they've met people in my life who are in recovery, who've relapsed and overdosed and died. They've met people in my life who were in recovery, who've relapsed and, crashed cars, and they've seen people, very close to them who had a result, who've lost their life or are incarcerated as a result of it, and they've seen what drugs and alcohol can do to people. Now, I've also been very open and honest with them that other people can, maybe smoke cannabis and go to a concert and come home and never smoke it again for months, or have a drink with dinner, and and that doesn't make them bad. That doesn't mean what they're doing is bad, but there are risks associated with it. Right. And, I've talked to them about the fact that, like, you may be more at risk than others as a result of your genetics. And so you can try using drugs or drinking when you get older if you want. I'm not going to stop you, and I'm not going to tell you just do it. But know what's going to happen. And you just can't do it when you live here. Right. And so I think, just those open and honest conversations really change the culture around it. And make it, okay, I'm not telling you it's bad or the people that do it are bad, because they're not. They're not bad people. None of the people that I've worked with in the history of working in substance use are bad people. They're good people with a bad illness, and they make bad decisions as a result of their illness. And so, knowing that recovery is possible, and I think the more that we talk about recovery and more that we can be open and honest about what recovery is and the pathways to get there, and that, make it accessible for people, then we can start to see some of that culture shift and change in the direction of things can get better here.
Yeah. And it's being factual and being open and honest, like you were saying, right? It's like about presenting the black and white. Like, there kind of is no gray area. Like, you could still be under the influence. It is a choice that you're making where you're going to be impaired, right? So these are just the facts. So we're not beating around the bush here. This is what it is. So I like that open transparency with individuals and families is always key in building relationships, right? So, well. Thank you both. I think this has been a great conversation, and we will talk if there's a next time.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.